Okay, hey everyone. Last blog post for 2016. I know it's been a while since I posted some stuff, but yeah, been pretty busy. So this is going to be around an interesting scenario that I came across that in some cases you have a workflow that runs, that you have some logic in there that causes the workflow to fail. And for whatever reason, you can't capture that error, right? Like we usually like to do with like the call web service action or query BCS or something like that that has the error handling section at the bottom of the configuration in Nintex workflow. Some actions actually don't have that. So that causes that particular workflow to fail. Now I'm going to jump into a workflow design in here. So ignore all these, just look at this convert value action. Now this convert value action is trying to convert some junk text that I have in the title field into a date, right? Store it in a date control. So of course, if it's not formatted in a date format, this is going to fail. Now, I know there's an error handling section in here, but pretend there isn't, right? Let's say you are actually using a query list action and you're trying to get some data back. Now I'm going to pop this action open. Notice there's no error handling section here. Now, if you happen to be querying a particular list, maybe your filter is incorrect, or maybe you're querying a external data list, and for whatever reason, connectivity to the backend database is lost, this query list action is going to fail, causing your workflow to fail. And notice you really can't do anything about that. Your workflow is going to fail, and that's pretty much it. So here's a couple of little things that I found that could be helpful. So in this case, this workflow here called child failure is just logging some text, and then what we're doing is we're checking to see if the title field on the current item that my workflow is running on ends in the word work. So basically, whatever else it says in there, this workflow is going to run and fail. If it says work on the end, it's going to ignore this, not run this, and this action or this workflow will actually succeed. Okay, now where this becomes really handy is if you have a workflow that actually goes through and processes a bunch of data. And let's say it processes 100 items, goes through 50 of them and fails, and your workflow is smart enough that if you manually restart it, it continues going from where it left off rather than from the beginning. This is going to be a really helpful scenario. So pretend this is what this workflow does. So then we have another workflow called successful parent. Right. Basically, this workflow is going to be smart enough to do a lot of the heavy lifting for us around what happens if the child workflow fails. So this is what we do. I'm going to first of all look at a particular variable we have here called num. It's a number variable, child status, and we set it to a value of 3, and 3 being error occurred. Right. So just assume an error occurred as the first time this workflow starts. So this parent workflow, the successful parent, is the workflow that's configured to start when an item is created, right? Not the child workflow. So you'll notice here under the start settings, start when an item is created. Yes. Okay. Now, we go into a loop here and we'll say continue looping while that status does not equal to 5, and 5 being completed, right? This is assuming that workflow is completed. Okay, so continuous loop while the child is not completed. Then what we do is we go into a bit of a delay. So think of this as the child workflow. We've kicked it off. We're going to go into a loop. We're going to wait for a little bit. I set it to 1 minute. My environment's a little flaky, so again, it goes anywhere from 1 to 5 minutes. And then we have this check. So we'll run if, right? And we're checking all these different values for the child failure status field, right? So when a workflow runs, it creates a column called the name of the workflow, and then you have the different status in there. And behind the scenes of these, there's actually a numerical value. So looking back here, what we want to do is we only want to run the code or the actions inside this run if any of the following is true. Child failure workflow is equal to 1, and 1 being failed on start. 3 6, or 7. And 3, 6, or 7 are, so we got failed to start or failed on start, error occurred, failed on start retrying, and error occurred retrying. Right? I could probably ignore these, but I'm gonna take these into consideration. Okay. Now, if any of those scenarios have occurred, right? So if the child workflow is in any of those states, which basically means it's no longer running, it's just failed for whatever reason. What we're going to do is we're going to use this terminate workflow action. Terminate workflow action says stop the child workflow. And you can do all workflows, but we'll do the child workflow. What this actually does is if a workflow fails on its own, it gets set into this error occurred state. What that means is even though it's not really running, SharePoint still considers it a running workflow. So you won't be able to start another instance of that workflow while that one's already considered running. So what you need to do is you need to terminate it. So think of it as I click on this, and then I click on this end this workflow link to terminate this particular instance. This is the same thing, but what we're doing is we're automating that with this terminate workflow action. Next, because we know that it's failed, right, it didn't complete successfully, we're going to start a new instance. So like I said, hopefully your workflow is smart enough, or your child workflow is smart enough to continue from where it left off rather than starting from the very beginning and reprocessing everything again. Okay, now, once we've done this, or even if we didn't, we're going to go in here and we're going to store the current value of that child workflow in numChild status. Right? This is probably a little redundant, but that's okay. And then we're going to log some value, and then we're going to come back around the loop, and we're going to check what that status is. If that status is equal to 5, then we're going to ignore all this, and we're going to end this workflow. If it's not, we're going to come back, right? And by that status not being equal to 5, which is not completed, doesn't mean it's failed. It could be that it's still running, right? So this is just I only want to do this loop if this workflow is still running or errored. All right, so that's how easy it is, right? Not too complex, right? It's I think, a little confusing when you first kind of trying to get your head around it. It took me a little while to build this little logic in, but let's see what happens. I'm going to look at the workflow history here, and I'm going to go to and create a new item. And I'll just create a test 4. Now, because I'm actually logged in as a system account, the workflow won't automatically start. So let's kick off the parent workflow. Now, notice parent workflow started, automatically it started the child workflow and it failed. So let's have a look at what the parent workflow looks like. So in this case, we've started the workflow, we've gone into the loop. We're doing a pause. It's going to take around about a minute or so, and then we're going to run some other logic. So let's give it a second and we'll see what happens. All right, looks like we've gone past the pause. Now we've gone into the run if. Notice the run if the child workflow was in some sort of state that matched one of our conditions. So we terminated that instance, we started a new instance, and then logged some information, come back around, notice we're in a pause again. So let's come back here, refresh, and you should see 2 instances, right? One that's failed right here, and it's been cancelled, which is what that terminate workflow action does. Then we have another child, which again, it errored, but it's still in an errored state. So the workflow needs to cancel that one. So what we're going to do is we're going to come over here, we're going to go into our item, and we'll just add the end, the word work at the end, click on OK. All right. Again, let's look at the workflow history. This is going to take a few minutes, and then what will happen is we're going to come back around, we're going to start again, terminate that instance because we have an errored instance. We're going to start a new workflow, we're going to come back around, probably go into the pause again, and then check. Hopefully in this case, the workflow is finished, completed, so it'll not do this, find that it's equal to completed, which is 5, come back around the loop, and then exit out. So let's give that a little bit of a couple of minutes and see how that goes. Let's refresh this, make sure it's not already there. Okay, let's have a little bit of a wait. We'll see how that goes. Okay, now that we've refreshed the workflow status for a little few times, you can see here everything's green and everything successfully ran and we're done and the status of the parent workflow is completed. So if I actually go back and refresh this, you'll actually see we had 2 failures of the child workflow, and then finally we had the child workflow completed successfully, and therefore the parents completed successfully, right? So interesting little way of building some workflow logic. Like I said, though, you probably don't want to just constantly be restarting a child workflow. So this is really around some processing that you have in a child workflow that is smart enough to go through and do some work, and then if it fails for whatever reason and we restart it, that it's smart enough to actually continue on rather than redo the same work it did. The last thing you want to do is constantly be sending tasks to say upper management for the same thing over and over again because one of your child workflows is failing and being restarted constantly. Okay, hopefully this is helpful to some of you. Let me know if you find any other ways to do something very similar. I'd be interested to learn about those as well. So thanks for your time. Thanks for watching, and hope you guys have a happy new year.